This is an unscheduled special episode. Over the weekend, the US carried out a military operation in Venezuela, and reactions couldn't be more divided. Today, we're joined by Simon Dixon to break down what Bitcoiners need to understand about the situation. Venezuelans are celebrating in the streets, elated about the end of Maduro's rule. Critics, on the other hand, are warning that this is yet another case of American imperialism and that a new power struggle is already unfolding behind the scenes. So, what actually happened? What are the real geopolitical stakes? And what does any of this mean for people trying to protect themselves as power, money, and sovereignty collide? And what about the rumored Bitcoin mystery layered quietly beneath it all? A shadowy figure now missing, rumored to be the one person with access to a secret Bitcoin stash, potentially large enough to rival even MicroStrategy's. We're going to unpack that and even more today. Lock in, drop a like on the video. I'm Ben with the BTC Sessions, and this is your emergency weekly session. All right, so I want to welcome to the stage my co-host, Mr. Nathan Fitzsimmons, and our special guest, Mr. Simon Dixon. Gentlemen, great to see you. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you, Simon. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I was just visiting some family, and I guess we start 2026 with our first regime change.
Yep, apparently.
Yeah, this is interesting. The thing that's striking to me is the contrast that I mentioned in the intro, right? I know a number of Venezuelans, a number of Venezuelan Bitcoiners, and of course, the regime under Maduro was awful, right? It was, and so there's celebration happening with this, but at the same time, it also comes off like something out of Confessions from an Economic Hitman, but replacing the briefcases for bombers. Nathan, you were saying before the show, I've seen this movie before. So, I mean, I guess maybe the place to start off is, Simon, can you maybe give us just a straight rundown of what we actually know has happened and what kind of led up to this moment?
Yeah, sure. Why don't I do that? So last time I was on the show, we were talking about this concept of a proof of weapons network. And underneath this proof of weapons network, which backs up the world reserve currency, currently the dollar, you have these different complexes. Originally, most of its might came from a military industrial complex, which was might is right in order to take resources, in order to prop up the dollar and everything that creates the demand for the dollar. As the military became public and subordinate to what I call the financial industrial complex, you had a very complex operation that was set up where you have the dollar created by private commercial banks. You have a central bank that essentially regulates the cost of money, props up the system in distress, privatizes the gains and socializes the losses for its shareholders. And of course, the shareholders of the Federal Reserve are the same creators of the dollar. And so through this mechanism, you have the ability to create a debt-based Ponzi scheme where there's not enough dollars in order to pay off all the debt. So you have to roll over the debt. Now, one way of doing that is to swap debt for equity. And so you have the investment banks that basically take these resources and they securitize, financialize, and more recently tokenize them so that they can be traded the maximum value can be extracted from them. In order to feed technology into that, you have this private-public partnership like Silicon Valley, venture capital, private equity, Pentagon budgets, DARPA funds, which seeds all these technologies, which are normally used for killing people, and then deployed and privatized, where you get the end result is an iPhone that has some GPS and many of the resources that were extracted from foreign countries, run by energy, which requires oil and liquefied natural gas and various other things. And through this mechanism, if you can control as many of those routes, which controls sea routes, if you can control financial routes, if you can control currency, if you can control central bank, then you get to control the resources. So this is the financial industrial complex. And what we were all finally talking about, then I'll get straight to Venezuela, is this concept of a technical industrial complex, which is a rising power that came from the financial industrial complex, but where algorithm can potentially become more important than capital flows. And so therefore, by controlling data centers, which require energy, that require commodities, rare earth minerals, semiconductor chips, then you can build software on top of it, which can actually process information and create this artificial intelligence, social credit scores. And that can be integrated into both financial weapons like stable coins and real world assets, and military through cybersecurity, artificial intelligence warfare, drones. And this technology gets deployed around the world and beta tested in these war zones. And then again, just like eventually you end up with an iPhone that comes home after the technology has killed people, and then it comes back home, and that's what we're having with the technical industrial complex. So once you understand that, that's the whole flow of what props up the dollar. Now, interestingly, the dollar was propped up by dollar dominance. And so we've had America as a global hegemon ever since, this transition from the British Empire via World War I, World War II, and then the Bretton Woods Order, IMF, World Bank. And that gets into these Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which was a book by John Perkins. And he's hiding out in the Amazon rainforest trying to cleanse his soul right now, after the operations that he had to commit for the IMF in order to regime change, in order to destroy economies, in order to extract resources, in order to install central banks, and in order to enforce the world onto this dollar standard. And what you're witnessing right now is a typical play-by-play operation, which is that you financially weaken a country that has the resources that you want. You then put extreme sanctions that put it in an environment where you can create severe economic distress for the people. Once you have severe economic stress, you weaponize the media in order to make everything a narrative that changes the native population and also the people that fled the country and become immigrants, for example, the diaspora, the Venezuelan diaspora. You also have covert operations, which allow for the illegal, things that prop up many of these covert operations, which is drug trafficking, weapons trafficking, human trafficking, sex trafficking. Now, those are propped up by the deep state intelligence agencies. That's how they get their black op funding to do the illegal things off balance sheet so that they can then do those operations and bring the resources back for American corporate interest to prop up the stock market, create more GDP, require debt-based loans via the IMF, and then you can lend that money back to the US government. The more you can sell these bonds, the more you can recycle into stocks, and eventually you can invade countries, steal hard money like gold and silver. This was the British Empire model that was put into a neo-colonial model by the American Empire. So now let's get to Venezuela, and then we can have an interesting conversation about what just happened. If you look at the history of Venezuela, so firstly, the biggest thing that South America and Central America and Latin America really did wrong is they were sadly neighbors of the proof of weapons network, which was hosted in North America. And so the United States of America and the dollar, created this whole concept of a banana republic, where essentially intelligence agencies, which most people are fed a narrative that they work for national security, but they actually work for corporate interests of corporate America. And so what they do is they do these covert operations, they extract the resources, and they funnel the money back that props up the petrodollar and various other things. Now, Venezuela, there's a couple of really important components. One is a central bank that is connected to the Bank for International Settlements, which is an agreement to turn your economy into a debt-based Ponzi scheme for the banks. And so by using this system of IMF and Bank for International Settlements, you agree to basically turning your currency into debt. And once you turn your currency into debt, you have to install austerity, which is stop using money for any of the people of your resources and privatize them. Once they're privatized, the investment bank are able to exert currency wars and fire financial weapons of mass destruction to control the resources. And so this is, Venezuela has been through the complete history. Originally at different times, Venezuela, after these covert regime change, they would install dictators that are US friendly. And what they do is they have an agreement where they get lots of backhand money. They get to get very wealthy. But the agreement is they need to serve the US dollar and the US empire. Now, as part of that, they're made to look like they're the worst people in the world. So you have the media that creates the narrative to make them the worst people in the world. It's more useful if they are the worst people in the world because it's a lot easier to do. And so this whole concept of trying to liberate people to export democracy so that the people can have a good leader is just narrative on top of this model of the more corrupt and the more compromised the leader is, then the more wealthy they can get serving this proof of weapons network. And so you have these games, which I think are theater, like America's trying to take down Maduro, and we've seen all of this theater right now. But in the background, geopolitics of world powers are changing. You got China, you got Russia, you got America, and America is controlled by this proof of weapons network. So that is private interest. But when we see the theater, you've got the people that are the victims of the severe sanctions, the severe economic oppression, the fact that the resources were never being able to be used for the benefit of the people. And that kind of translates into somebody that's a figurehead, that's the battering ram. So for example, Trump right now, you think these are Trump decisions. This is more a JP Morgan decision, a Larry Fink and Chevron, Exxon, BlackRock, and the entire industrial complex decision. Trump's job is to find a narrative that's acceptable to the American people in the West, and become a battering ram for the different types of narratives. So if you're on the extreme left, you have a different narrative that it's like, this is imperialism, this is disgusting. And then if you're on the extreme right, this is making America great again. So what you have to understand is that everything that you see in the media and everyone you speak to are on some degree of that propaganda. And so if you're in Venezuela, there's the people that would love Venezuela, know what's happened to every other country that has been through a similar regime change. And even if their circumstance is extreme, they will love their leader because they know what the alternative is. And you have people that believe in the American dream, that America is going to come, liberate, install a liberal democracy, and suddenly Venezuela is going to be great through, what they're selling as capitalism, which means, oh, right, the resources become Chevron and Exxon. There's no sovereign wealth fund. And so what I think, I'll give what I think the key events are leading up to Venezuela today. If you think about it, the first time that a country really resisted against the empire to nationalize its resources that relates to this one was when Egypt tried to nationalize the Suez Canal to take control of the ports so that it then could strategically negotiate with an Arab League across the Middle East, and they could unify around their resources and become a competing power to the US. US doesn't want that. And so, what eventually happened is they take their proxy of the military industrial complex which around that time in the 70s is Israel, still is today. We're going through a change there. And Israel, people think like, oh, they're trying to create a Jewish state to help the Jewish people. No, they're a division of the military industrial complex. Mossad is one of the most sophisticated CIA connected intelligence agencies in the world. And whenever America wants to do something that is completely unacceptable constitutionally, narrative wise, then they push out Israel, and Israel goes and does it. And Israel becomes like the battering ram for it, while they're bringing back all the money and all the resources back to propping up the dollar and the American empire. So Israel was declared to go to war with Egypt at this time. And then there was an embargo by somebody else that was negotiating over their oil, which is Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia said, they were in a 50-50 agreement with the American empire at this point for their oil. But they were actually they were trying to take back their oil and use it for their people, which is why today you have like the best healthcare, you have no tax for the Saudi people, because essentially everyone gets to keep their money because the state is propped up rather than tax. It's by the oil resources. So Saudi did an oil embargo. And at this stage, the price of oil went through the roof because of the embargo. And this brought in massive, massive wealth for Venezuelan oil. And it already had its partners with Chevron, Exxon, and various other US interests. But it brought in a significant amount of oil wealth. Now, what happened during this time is the price of oil went up so high, and all of this is very significant when we analyze what comes next. The price of oil went so high that people started to look for alternative, build different different routes in order to get their energy. Because wherever energy flows, the higher the price of oil and energy, you get inflation. The supply side, you have monetary inflation, and then you have oil base, which is the backbone of every car, everything moving, every delivery. It's the backbone of everything. So where energy flows and who controls that energy, power follows. And so, yeah, lots of people started to hedge. You had alternative forms of energy, different routes put together. And basically, this then flooded the market. You also had a covert regime change in Saudi Arabia. King Faisal was assassinated. Suddenly, they started to join Safari Club, which was a pro-US CIA intelligence network, with the European powers and the Middle Eastern powers. So you had that regime change, and suddenly you had a more, petrodollar negotiated. At the time, remember, America was in war with Venezuela. Vietnam at this time. It was breaking off. It was defaulting on its obligations with oil. France had turned up with a naval ship saying, "Give me my gold." They were defaulting on the gold. They came off the gold window. And so all of this leads up to where the market for oil just significantly corrected. And because most of the profits were still going to Chevron and Exxon, you had like this massive economic disaster where there was no sovereign wealth. The amount of revenue, their cut of the oil that Venezuelans were able to maintain went down significantly. And you ended up with the 70% of the population in extreme poverty and extreme, then when you get extreme populism. And so most people, they either go radical left, radical right. I want America to take over, bomb our country and install a liberal democracy. And then on the left, they start turning more to let's nationalize our resources. So long story short, there was leadership that was changed. The leadership decided that it wanted to take on and nationalize its oil. And that became a problem for the American empire and the petrodollar. And so ever since then, you've had massive, massive sanctions, which made the situation worse and worse and worse. But in those sanctions, what was agreed in the end was kind of forwarding to where we are right now, after Chavez and everything else. We have Maduro in power, where the sanctioned state that Chevron and Exxon are able to, they have very hard oil, and you need additional refinement and investment in order to make it where it can be consumed across America and different places. And so Chevron and Exxon actually have control already of Venezuelan oil. The sanctioned state that the Venezuelan people or the Venezuelan government can't benefit from it. That's the current agreement. And Maduro already agreed to that. So he gets very wealthy from these corrupt deals. The sanctioned state that the Venezuelan government doesn't get to use any of the money. Chevron Exxon benefits. But at the same time, what happened in Trump administration 1, America became an exporter of oil and gas and energy independent. That changed everything. So once America no longer needed anyone else and competed with all the oil exporters, the entire map and the entire world changed. This is why we come over to the Biden administration. We have the Russia-Ukraine side of it, another factor into this. But all this to say is that Chevron and Exxon were making great revenue. Maduro was cooperating and probably enriching himself significantly. The Venezuelan people were doing worse and worse. But who was actually buying all of that oil? Well, it was China. Because China is actually building, they don't have their own energy. They're building all sorts of renewable energy. But they needed, China was providing all the revenue. Chevron and Exxon were receiving all the money. There was corruption in the middle that was skimming off the money. The Venezuelan people were getting worse and worse and worse. And at the same time, the deep state did what I consider to be an open border, closed border operation in America. And so you flood all the immigrants into America at a higher rate during the Biden administration. This creates demographic change, manufactures civil unrest, creates the type of environment you need for the Trump administration narrative. And so you had all these demographic issues, these immigration issues. Remember, crime, it was the drugs narrative is all narrative because there is cocaine that comes from Venezuela, but fentanyl is mainly via Mexico and via those networks. And those networks are CIA sponsored. They're meant to happen. This is, they're never coming after the drugs. The drugs is a source of revenue for the deep state by having partnerships with these drug cartels. And so you have all of this perfect narrative. You have immigration, you have they're flooding the borders. Well, if you want to close the borders, just close the borders. That's what Trump did. If you want to deploy Palantir and have a surveillance state, you can have Palantir in a surveillance state. So that kind of brings us to where we are right now. China's providing the revenue. America needs GDP, so they want the stock market. They're running the economy hot. Basically, the Trump administration is rolling over the debt, trying to sell as many bonds as possible, roll over the debt, roll over the debt, roll over the debt, is strategically weakening the dollar, creating an inflationary environment, and that inflation is going to go in two places. All the money's going back to the US stock market. And so Trump needs the stock market to keep going up. You can't have a correction in the stock market. You need war. You need oil. You need anything that increases the revenue of the stock market and the earnings per share. That share price has to go up so it can keep selling bonds, roll over the debt, roll over the debt. And in the sacrifice to that is you get inflation. So asset prices, which are concentrated in the hands of few, are making the rich richer and the poor poorer. But what is the best way to combat inflation? There's only 3 ways to combat inflation in a fiscal dominance environment where you're printing money like crazy, selling as many bonds as crazy, and pumping everything into the stock market. Well, firstly, you're going to get asset price inflation. You're going to get a weakening of the dollar. And the only 3 ways to combat inflation is to tax more, because taxing more takes money out of the system. So you had the tariff policy, which was a $400 billion tax revenue at small business, those small businesses go bust and they get consolidated into the proof of weapons network. So you've had record M&A by investment banks. But when you tax, they don't use that revenue. When you're printing money, that's what's paying for everything. You don't need that money to fund the government. It takes money out of the economy and into the Federal Reserve account, which is disinflationary. So that's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is to invest in a disinflationary technology, which is AI and robotics. That has a side effect. It takes everyone's job. It's very, very productive and very, very efficient, but you're going to get really employment issues at that stage. And the third way to do it is get the cost of energy down. And so what America is going to do right now is Chevron and Exxon are going to get significant government funding so that the American people pay for it, but the profits will be privatized to Chevron and Exxon. The Venezuelans won't have access to any of the benefit from it. This will increase the US stock market. It will increase revenue. So we'll get on Monday, we're likely to get a turnaround in the stock market's at record highs. You're going to have a continuation of the stock market at record highs. Obviously, that has impact in the Bitcoin and crypto market. Where was I saying? I was talking about the three things.
Talking about using energy price come down to combat inflation, or at least hide it.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, but there is a massive side benefit for everybody that's suffering in a cost of living crisis right now. The price of oil is going to come down. They're going to flood the market with oil. That's going to make it cheaper for China to build up bigger oil reserves. It's going to squeeze Russia further into China. America is, the private sector is going to make much more revenue. They don't care if the prices come down a bit. And then the Gulf countries, that has impact in the petrodollar and their sovereign wealth. So what has effectively happened here in the last year through tariff policies and via, these different operations to gain access to 305 billion barrels of oil in Venezuela. At today's price, it's about $59, I think, last time I checked. That's about 17 to 18 trillion dollars of revenue. That's not including all the rare earth minerals, the other types of things, the gold supplies. So essentially what this does is it shrinks America into a regional power. The proof of weapons network is extracting more and more, and they found a way of combating fiscal dominance and the wealth extraction that's going to the wealthy right now through flooding the markets with oil to combat some of that inflation. And so this, if I'm taking all the emotion out of it, because I think it's disgusting, but if I take all the emotion out of it, this is a classic proof of weapons network play. And what you have to understand is this financial industrial complex, this isn't, in my perspective, this isn't something that is, all right, is China going to start World War III? Is Iran was selling drones, Russia was selling weapons, China was buying oil. That's right on America's border. This is the Western Hemisphere. This region will be dominated by the US proof of weapons network. The rest of the world is being freed and liberated from the dollar and the petrodollar. So the currency is being shrunk into a regional currency. We're getting all of these geopolitical changes, and then that kind of, I guess I pulled everything together into one. Let's take some of the questions. All I want to say is I'll leave you with one thought.
Yep.
Russia would have agreed. From my perspective, how I see the world, Russia would have agreed, China would have agreed, US would have agreed, Maduro would have agreed. We're getting a theater right now. He'll be incredibly wealthy. He'll probably have a fake, trial or something like that. But there'll be a settlement. He's already negotiated an exit strategy. And America gets the narrative that while America is being shrunk into a regional power, they look strong. And so this is achieving all the goals that we're moving to a multipolar world. And this is changing everything we know about everything we've experienced the whole time that we've been alive.
Okay, I have a few things I want to unpack, and then Ben, I promise I'll let you jump in there too. One thing that stood out to me is, one, how is it that Russia benefits in this situation? Because I see how China does, right? They're going to get lower energy costs for their input, but Russia being a net exporter, wouldn't this actually hurt Russia? And if I'm understanding it correctly, it seems like the U.S. is basically accepting the multipolar end goal. They're saying that's going to happen, and so we're going to move in that sort of direction right now. So we're going to allow China to get the benefits of a lower energy cost as well too, and just focus on our area of the world. Do I have that kind of correct?
Yeah, we got the acceptance of an agreed negotiation of the multipolar world order when Trump implemented Trump tariffs. So April the 2nd, 2025 was the formal agreement that America is going to be a regional power and shrunk. Now, in those negotiations, with all of those tariff policies, what was happening? Well, Trump was saying, India, come to the table, and you're going to sit down with the real powers, not the president, not the government. You're going to sit down with Larry Fink. You're going to sit down with Jamie Dimon. You're going to sit down with Boeing and Chevron and Exxon. And we're going to agree, what do we need to do in order to, resolve all of the different ports that America used to control? And what are we going to do about the dollar demand? And what are we going to do about the SWIFT system and all these different systems? And so based upon the relative power of all these different superpowers, they have been executing all of those negotiations. I think they hit, these are the regions that are yours. And so Venezuelan oil became America, Chevron and Exxon's asset. Russia, this will weaken Russia. But what do they get instead? They get Ukraine.
I was going to say, the U.S. gets out of their area of the world. They're giving up the revenue for more control over their region.
Exactly. So America will continue the aggression so that Russia can control more of Ukraine. They'll continue to sell weapons to prop up the stock market to the U.S. military industrial complex. And who are they going to get to pay for it? NATO and Europe. And so Europe is being sacrificed because they're fully vassalized under the U.S. corporate empire of the proof. The loser of this whole thing is Europe. And the Russia-Ukraine war was a war between the financial industrial complex, the U.S. proof of weapons network, and Europe, to hand over Ukraine and sacrifice Ukrainians while selling weapons to prop up the U.S. stock market. Basically BlackRock and Russia will own Ukraine. China will have Taiwan and all the semiconductor chips. And they will continue to sell, as these agreements will sell as many weapons, in order to have military industrial complex cells. But those are different to the covert operations in order to have colored revolution, destabilization campaigns, just like the CIA did in China with the Uyghurs and various other separatist groups that you fund in order to destabilize regions. All the things they've always done in Central America, South America, they're still doing in Africa with ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram and all these other ones. The BRICS and the Gulf countries would have agreed what the future of the petrodollar looks like. They already shrunk it by 70% by doing this Iran, Saudi Arabia, BRICS, China trade. And China set up an alternative barter system where you can get credit at the PBOC, and then you can use that in order to pay for all the different goods so that you can circumvent US sanctions. And India and the Gulf countries and China have all built alternate payment rails that work without the SWIFT system. And we're getting significant investment in the crypto industry across the Gulf countries and various other things. So what does Russia get? They get Ukraine.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Ben, get in there.
Yeah. Simon, I'm wondering if you can kind of help me understand in and around this idea of the U.S. becoming more of a regional power in a multipolar world. I mean, it's been how long that they've had this exorbitant privilege of the world reserve currency, and with the gradual dissolution of that, Are the tactics that you're talking about enough to maintain that degree of privilege or some degree of privilege? And do you see the Genius Act and some of the stablecoin leaning as another tactic to help kick the can down the road as well?
Yeah. So I don't believe that the US wants dollar dominance. I think that the US financial industrial complex that controls America is negotiating with the Gulf countries and is preparing for the next move in the world. And they're preparing two moves. One move is the multipolar world that is apparent. If you look at what did Trump do to the dollar, well, it corrected by approximately 11% relative to shitcoins like the euro, the Japanese yen, the Swiss franc, and various others. So if you look at DXY, that was strategically weakened. When Trump says things like, I'm taking on the deep state, you're saying when you close USAID, when you close the National Endowment of Democracy, that's what propped up the Middle East through funding terrorist groups in order to destabilize countries so you could force them to buy back the dollars and the IMF loans. So you're now deconstructing what propped up the dollar. And so when in this environment, you can't say to the American people, we're sacrificing world reserve currency, which is what he would say if he was honest. What he has to say is we're making America great again. The economy is the best that it's ever been, which means the stock market, not, which is massive wealth inequality just because of the distribution of wealth that benefits from it. And at the same time, you can have a few narratives that make it look like you're going to go for dollar dominance. One of those is stable coins. So if you look at three essential nodes in the proof of weapons network, you've got Elon Musk, which I believe is the social credit score part of the equation. You've got David Sachs, which is the AI cryptocurrency stablecoin part of the equation. And then you got Peter Thiel, which is the artificial intelligence warfare and control grids and pre-crime surveillance state part of the equation. These are all the PayPal mafia, and they've been installed around the Trump administration. Then you also had Steve Witkoff, who is doing all the money laundering deals between the Middle East and America through stable coins and pardoning people like CZ, getting Binance its investment, various other like over the counter types of deals that have been happening. And so you combine all this together. What actually, I remember it was, when Dr. Jack gave his original podcast about on your channel about who, and started talking about, who Satoshi Nakamoto is. Once you understand that, you realize that most likely Bitcoin was a gateway drug for a central bank digital currency and stablecoin standard to get the world on digital currency, then try to custody as much Bitcoin, but the rich and wealthy get Bitcoin in self-custody as an escape valve. That's kind of where we are right now. And so everything you're seeing in crypto and Genius Act is about enhancing power for the technical industrial complex and the financial industrial complex and military industrial complex. It allows banks to use their Federal Reserve reserves to create collateral as a stable coin. It says everyone that wants to do this and offer yield has to become a bank and apply to be a bank. And at the same time, we had the Samurai Wallet case where it kind of allowed come after self-custody in a public show. And it had the pardoning of everyone that was involved in the crypto lobby that was able to pay their shitcoin money in order to compromise Trump. The Trump family has tripled, I reckon, quadrupled, and in terms of future, really massively increased his net worth. And the Genius Act is let's make America crypto capital. What that means is let's build an Orwellian 1984 surveillance state nightmare version of the dollar, where it is stable coins, i.e. privatized interest, and Europe and everyone else will have a central bank digital currency so that we can extract all of the resources from Europe and the neighbors, and we'll call them crazy communists and socialists and crazy radical left and all that stuff. we'll look like the capitalist ones, while the meantime we're extracting all of the resources via these stable coins. We get to, funnel off all of the interest on the debt. We get to buy some Bitcoin with it. Meantime, what are we doing with our Bitcoin strategic reserve? Oh, right, we're stealing it.
Yep.
And so all of the Bitcoin strategic reserves have just been theft so far. In fact, I'm a Bitfinex shareholder. Mr. Trump, the Department of Justice said that those 119,000 Bitcoins that you probably got Israel to hack and steal from us belong to shareholders. Now they're on your balance sheet as a Bitcoin strategic reserve. I'm not sure that was the essence of it, but so no, I don't think stable coins are about propping up the dollar. I think it's a technical industrial complex, because they know who is the biggest enemy of the empire in the closing debt moment, the asset stripping moment. It's the people. So if we get a revolution, if we get tax boycotts, if we get mortgage and rent boycotts, then we get our Orwellian 1984 nightmare, and we deploy our control grid technology that we beta tested all around the world in all these war zones. We bring it back.
Nathan, I think this is, given we just chatted briefly on Bitcoin reserves and stealing them, there was an interesting, Simon, I don't know if you saw this, there's an interesting article at a Zero Hedge, and the title was "The $60 billion question: Is Venezuela secretly a Bitcoin superpower?" Basically, what they're positing is that that over the last number of years, including in and around 2018, that they were exporting a lot of the oil and gold and actually having somebody convert them via OTC brokers to Bitcoin, or at least partially. And so given the kind of time frame there to now, they said that they could be looking at a strategic Bitcoin reserve from Venezuela that could be rivaling something like MicroStrategy. Again, that's assuming all of those things were converted, but they could still be sitting on a stack. First of all, have you seen the article? Second of all, if so, do you have any thoughts there? But do you think that the U.S. is taking a peek at trying to add to its reserve this way if they should come across those keys?
I haven't read the article. It makes total sense to me that would be the case. From my intel, like, I invested in companies that were providing different types of Bitcoin services, and the people that I know in Venezuela, there was a tightly controlled Bitcoin mining angle to what was happening in Venezuela. Some people, if they were able to make the right type of corrupt deals, they were able to continue Bitcoin mining. But I would be very surprised if Venezuela wasn't engaging in large scale Bitcoin mining. And they would definitely have had some kind of over the counter operation, just like in the Financial Times. You notice these things come in cycles. The Financial Times is just a mouthpiece for the financial industrial complex. So what they say is what they want you to believe, so that they can control capital flows, and then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But they started talking about how Iran has been circumventing sanctions using Bitcoin and crypto by selling weapons. I think Iran may have been doing this via Venezuela. Like, some of these flows make total sense in terms of my understanding what might have been happening around the world. And so here's the most important thing. Most people think that US is trying to fix their sovereign problem. That's not what they're doing. They're weakening the dollar. They're killing the economy to the wealthy, and they're propping up the stock market. The only thing that matters is private wealth. The debt is the people's problem, and the people in charge of America don't care about people. They only care about stocks go up, and so firstly, when America invaded Iraq, the gold just never made it to the US balance sheet. It just disappeared.
Of course it did.
It went into the CIA coffers. It went off balance sheet, and there were vast gold reserves. So everything that's happening in America, it's not like America has a sovereign wealth fund. There was an executive order saying they were having one. And if I were American, I'd be questioning that. Because if this is going to happen, then those assets should go in the sovereign wealth fund. But that's not what's going to happen. I would be amazed if that happened, and we should do another show if it does. That's all going to be chopped up and carved up for US corporate interest. And that will go straight into the CIA coffers to fund and support the dark web drug operations that ain't going to go away. And so that will go into the human trafficking, drugs trafficking bucket. And you'll probably never see them. Now, if there was a movement to get those as Bitcoin strategic reserves, then that should be the Venezuelan sovereign wealth fund. But if it ends up as an American sovereign wealth fund, if this ends up as a Venezuelan or American sovereign wealth fund, I would be very, very surprised. It's going to disappear and it's going to end up in corporate off-balance sheet black op operations.
Yeah, it's just like the money in Bitfinex. It should be the Venezuelans, but it's not gonna. They might get sucked up somewhere else. And I just had this one interesting thought I just want to share quickly. That wouldn't it be absolutely crazy if the reason they didn't audit Fort Knox is because Iraq's gold was hanging out there, and there's actually more than there should have been. They didn't want to necessarily reveal that at the time. I did want to point out one thing too, because not only. So there's the accusations. There's Alex Saab, a Colombian Venezuelan businessman, and Maduro allies accused of masterminding the conversion of a lot of gold and oil assets into Bitcoin, upwards of about 60 billion. But the other thing I found while looking into that as well too is I didn't realize this, but Venezuela was selling oil to new clients using Tether starting in Q1 of 2024. So the idea that it's not about, because if they were already a user of the US dollar stablecoin, why would you want to necessarily take them out? That's an added demand for those dollars right there. So it makes perfect sense to me that even though they were using Tether, that's not the main goal. That's not the issue here. That's why they were comfortable taking them out. And I did want to ask and touch on as well too, because man, these networks get incredibly complex. Like even I'm reminded of like the Iran-Contra moment as well too, and just funds and goods and weapons and drugs moving across borders in order to finance basically shady operations. Is there any relationship between what we just saw in Venezuela and the current like central banking crisis that we're seeing in Iran right now? Because it seems way too much of a coincidence for both those two things to be going on at the same time, and at the same time as like Chinese diplomats were in Venezuela as well.
Yeah, so the Iran one is pretty interesting. From my perspective, and I have a contrary view here, most people in my circles and anti-war circles, they think Israel rules the world and they're going to be using America to go to war with Iran, and it's going to be Iraq and Syria 2.0. That's what most people in my circles think. I think the opposite. I think Iran has pragmatically regime changed itself already. So when we had that 12-day war between Iran, US, and Israel, that was a very coordinated theater. And so you can tell the difference between a real war, which is Iraq, a proxy war, which is like Syria, and a theater, which is what we saw with the 12-day war. The end result, and I covered it live as it was happening, because the markets didn't move. No one believed that the Strait of Hormuz was going to be closed. Oil didn't react in any way that it would have if this was really going to happen. And in fact, Middle Eastern stocks and ETFs started getting a steady flow as well, as if powers and Gulf sovereign wealth funds and the financial industrial complex and BlackRock knew exactly what was going to be happening when you were following the money. So what actually happened during that 12-day war is Israel, a proxy of the US military industrial complex. I personally believe they're changing their role slightly. Because America is selling all these defense contracts with the Gulf countries, which removes the need for Israel as an agitator of the forever war to destabilize the region. And so they're trying to find their utility at the moment. And so they're mainly partnering with the financial industrial complex. And so what they're doing is they're gaining more and more land so that when BlackRock is negotiating with the Gulf sovereign wealth funds, they've got more leverage in those negotiations. And so when like Giuliani, who's ex-ISIS, that is now the president of Syria, that is now gone to the Trump administration and sat in the White House, immediately they gave him credibility. They said they'll lift sanctions. But before lifting the major sanctions, Trump had to go meet all of his banks and JP Morgan and Citibank, and they were carving up the land to make sure they could front run all the Syrian people before the sanctions get removed. So they're doing like 40 on one of the most hottest growth regions. In order to do that, they need Syria to look crazy. So they pushed out a media campaign saying, oh, the Muslims are killing the Christians and ISIS is coming back and all that stuff. That's basically how you get yourself a better deal. You push away all the normal investors, you delay what's coming next, and then the banks and everyone swoop in, and you get more leverage over the Gulf countries that are trying to decolonize at the moment and partner with BlackRock and various other things. Now, with Iran has historically, if you look at the Middle East, there's always been a strategic tension between Iran and Israel, and this fight has always been a theater. We need a safe home for the Jews, and we're helping the Jews, which is recruiting an army so that you can do covert operations, and then you can fund organizations like ISIS and Al Qaeda, fund both sides, and make it look like there's terrorist battles. That's strategic.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, Simon, too, I believe at one point in time, if that was still the case, that like weapons going to Iran from the U.S. were going through Israel.
Correct. So you can all of these flows can be mapped out at different points. The point is not to get too big into the detail. Julian Assange and WikiLeaks was, helped us figure all this stuff out. And then you can read books like Operation Gladio really explains this by Paul Williams. Read Covert Regime Change. It goes through 100 different covert operations since World War II, where you can see from all the declassified documents and various other things. These things are very well documented. I know people are going to want to call me a conspiracy theorist. I didn't like just go down this route without figuring out whether there was something to this or not. I spent 25 years on this stuff to figure these monetary flows out. It's what led me to Bitcoin in the first place, because I wanted to boycott and opt out. But anyway, with Iran, what you're going to see right now is every part of the Middle East is going to be resolved with these territorial disputes, which means that the military-industrial complex is moving towards supporting them with defense rather than agitating wars. And so Israel is giving more and more leverage, but eventually they're not going to be funded by these military-industrial complex. And so we've got this whole tech play that's happening as well. Now, Iran has already been regime changed. So during the 12-day war, prior to that, you'll notice that higher up levels of leadership in defense and the political arm crashed down in a helicopter and no one talked about it. When no one talks about it and they don't create a PR campaign, normally a PR campaign is leading up to a regime change, right? You want to galvanize everybody. You want everyone to think they're defending democracy. You have women's coming out and saying, I want my rights and I want to take off the hijab. And then you have all those viral videos that Elon tells everyone about. And you get the whole media campaign and blitz. That one went very quiet. To me, when it goes quiet, it means it's an inside job. That was IRGC that regime changed their own country. Now, they also, various other hardliners were taken out by strategic precision strikes. Israel does not do strategic precision strikes unless they want to, which means that Iran probably signed off on who was going to be struck. At the same time, Iran came and, decimated parts of Israel in terms of Mossad ops and various other things. That would not be an acceptable thing if the military-industrial complex didn't want that to happen. You do not. And so you had these coordinated fire rockets and then the weakening of the Iron Dome and then Israel draining its economy. The port started to go bankrupt. UAE started acquiring strategic assets. They were pushed into deals with Egypt that create strategic choke points and dependencies. And basically the stock market went up in Israel because they're vassalizing. And what did Netanyahu do? He privatized all of the resources of Israel over time. So he did the vassalization strategy. The only country that's able to buy Israeli assets is UAE. And Iran allowed Hezbollah to be decapitated through the pager operation. Remember, Iran wasn't funding Hamas. That was Qatar. Qatar is a US ally. It's got the largest US military base. And the office of Hamas is in Doha upon request of the US. If you want to get money into Palestine, it goes via the Israeli banking system, or it goes via the Egyptian border, which is controlled by Israel, IMF, USAID funding. And so these are all covert operations. October the 7th was an operation. It wasn't anything like you were told it is. It was allowed to happen. And the idea was to level everything based upon agreements. And Iran, during that 12-day war, executed the regime change. America came in and had this whole theater. Trump was saying, we're going to go do the B-52. We're going to take out the nuclear program. If you remember, do you remember right when the B-2 bomber hit? There was a massive hit in the hash power of Bitcoin mining.
Oh, yeah.
Right at that time. Now, that did coincide with a blackout in Texas, so that might explain it. But at the same time, it kind of coordinated with movements of a nuclear program to different locations around Bitcoin mining. We'll never know the full truth. But I think it's an interesting thing that happened there. So America got the narrative. They got to say, we took out Iran's nuclear program. Israel got to say, we have constrained we've taken out the head of the snake. And Iran got to say, we showed Israel that we've got hypersonics. We can beat the Iron Dome. And everyone got the narrative that they were needed to say, we won. And so all the different media pieces went in the different, the Israeli media was different to the American media, which was different to Press TV and the Iranian media. And so it gave everyone that narrative. Now, there is genuinely massive economic distress in Iran, and China benefits from that as well, because, China is building massive oil reserves. It's buying them from everybody. It's diversifying. But also that allows these alternative payment routes that have been set up. But Iran is under severe economic distress. Now, interestingly, I actually think that these protests were a bottom-up movement. Most people think it was like a coordinated color revolution for regime change. I do think they've been co-opted to a certain degree, because you always get the anti-Khamenei, types of factions, and then you get the American Iranian like monarchists that all come out and say, we're going to topple the regime, and we want Israel to go in. You get all of that stuff. But they are under severe economic distress, and there is a genuine plight. I think it will be self-contained, because Iran has negotiated that they're no longer funding proxies. Qatar and GCC are doing Hamas in a final de-weaponization agreement with BlackRock and the financial industrial complex. All of those deals, and you're seeing everything being resolved. Suddenly, Israel recognized Somaliland. Somaliland is all UAE investment. That's UAE territory. It connects into the Red Sea, which connects into the Houthis. So what happened in Yemen? All of a sudden, UAE and Saudi are made out like they're having a fight. And then suddenly UAE pulls out, Saudi's in charge of Yemen, and you'll get a de-weaponization of the Houthis in Yemen at the moment. Somalia is Turkey's territory. They've made the most strategic investments. And then that coordinated with a campaign in the West around Somalian corruption. That was the exact same time. And look, that corruption was real as well. But as I said, the best operations are when they're real, and then you weaponize them. And so you get the Western destabilization campaign fueling racial tensions, fueling religious tensions. That helps the technical industrial complex. You just had the rollout of digital ID in Texas, in the UK. Like, all of these different operations help the technical industrial complex. But the Middle East, while it looks like chaos, and it looks like there's going to be escalation with Iran, if there is, it will be just like the 12-day war. It will be agreed. It will be a few more IRGC hardliners. From my perspective, Iran is 100% bought into the regional vision. China normalized between Saudi Arabia and Iran. That was historically the tension. And Israel is going through a strategic economic weakening campaign and acquisition at the moment. But, you know, for America, they need a narrative, right? Their narrative is, we're the good people. We would never do that thing that they did in Palestine. We would never do a genocide, even though the dollar through its whole history and the pound have been backed up by every genocide we ever know of, every ethnic cleansing campaign, every settler colonial resource extraction campaign. But they get to say, yeah, that was the crazy Israel. They blackmailed us. Who's the blackmail? We said it's Mossad and it's Israel and they rule the world, but who rules Israel and Netanyahu? The military industrial complex. Who does the military industrial complex have? They have the CIA, the deep state, and those Jeffrey Epstein blackmail operations. So it's all connected in a circular flow to prop up the dollar. But if you weaken Israel, then you also breaking the petrodollar. If you wage war with Europe over Ukraine, then you're breaking the euro dollar. You then get Japan to put up the interest rates, and now you break the Japan carry trade. And then you engineer a weakening of the dollar through tariff policies by manufacturing agents of chaos. And what do people do with their treasuries? They sell their treasuries and they buy gold and then they buy silver. So this is I see it as a very positive managed decline to shrink America into a regional power with the narrative that's needed in order to say we're making America great again. And the compensation that America got to agreeing was Venezuelan assets for the private sector.
Simon, I want to kind of take this down to the level of the individual. There's so much going on. This can be very overwhelming for people to listen to. I see people in the comments like, this is an amazing conversation. But I also see people saying, like, what does this mean for me? What do I as an individual do to navigate this? And of course, a lot of Bitcoiners tuning in here, probably a number of people that are just curious about, you know, what is going on. But what would you say to the average Bitcoiner that's out there looking at this saying, how do I navigate this? How do I, to a degree, maintain a status as like the sovereign individual kind of thesis? How do I go about that?
You said the key two words, sovereign individual. That is the promise of Bitcoin, and you need to maintain that promise. And in fact, we need you to maintain that promise because there is a very deliberate operation to centralize as much Bitcoin as possible right now. And we need a core community that's running their own nodes, that holds their Bitcoin in self-custody, and is not borrowing against their Bitcoin in order to be margin called in market manipulation. They're not buying MicroStrategy. They're not leveraging. They're not trading. They're not leaving their coins in exchange. They're not using the BlackRock Bitcoin ETF. Everything that was brought to us is the exact opposite of what we need the majority of people to do. Now, most people won't do that. So the Bitcoin community, the ones that are willing to listen to this podcast, you're the ones that are going to be able to make sure that Bitcoin remains what it needs to remain. You know, we need to be engaging in the you know, the different types of node debates that are happening. We need to be aware of operations and compromises, and we need to get back to our roots of Bitcoin improvement proposals, understanding what Bitcoin is, self-custody, helping people, as many people, become sovereign, because they're not going to take down Bitcoin in self-custody because they want it. The wealthy want it. When they crashed the British Empire, they still kept the little island colonies around because they needed them. The elites need Bitcoin in self-custody, but they want everyone else to have it in custody, leverage it up, put it on a bank, borrow against it. So your job is just to do the simplest thing that is what a Bitcoiner should be doing. You need to be working on your sovereign strategy. So what does that mean? It means over the next 5 to 10 years, this is a journey. This isn't quick. You need to put together a 10-year plan right now, and you're running out of time. You've probably already been working it on 10 years. You've probably already been engaging in BTC sessions content. You've already been figuring out your hardware wallet. You've been figuring out how to run a node. If you're not doing that already, now is the time to go through all of this content and start slowly setting some New Year's resolutions to engage in that process, because we need a core community that still use Bitcoin for what it was originally designed to do, which is freedom, not just number go up technology. Look, I have no doubt about number go up technology. BlackRock doesn't try and centralize an asset and make it the number one revenue stream without wanting to make a shit ton of money out of it. You don't switch to a multipolar world order and not have the only digital scarce asset that doesn't become a negotiating chip in these power struggles and power games. You don't kill strategy. You utilize strategy, you co-op strategy, you laden it with debt, you get as much Bitcoin in there as possible, you sell as much shares as possible so that it needs to raise as much money from the financial industrial complex so that whenever you want to crash the price of Bitcoin short term, or you want to do any of that, you've got your derivatives complex and you've got strategy as the perfect centralizing mechanism. You've got 21 capital that will get you to borrow against your Bitcoin, roll up, strike, put it in custody, work with Tether and Howard Lutnick. If you don't know that Tether and Howard Lutnick are extremely important geopolitically strategic assets to the financial industrial complex, you have to treat them like that already. They are co-opted. They will be co-opted. They are part of the system. This is what Bitcoin is resisting against. Tether is creating the largest private mining operation of Bitcoin around the world in these strategic locations. They got 8,888 Bitcoin from the US debt in the last quarter. They are getting as much Bitcoin centralized into that honeypot as possible. Strategy's doing the same. BlackRock's doing the same. Howard Lutnick is going around via his son in Cantor Fitzgerald and the Trump administration via his sons and Steve Witkoff via his sons. They're all creating these, they're cashing it in as much as possible in Bitcoin while asset stripping into this change of empire. So what do you need to do? You need to own more Bitcoin every day, every week, every month. You need to buy into weakness. You need to have a longer term plan. They want to make you borrow against your Bitcoin. They control the short-term price already. The long-term price is not under their control. So self-custody, understanding that we need to fight the network. There will be a fight at some time by running nodes. Spending local, not investing in treasury companies. Not engaging, opt out, boycott. Bitcoin was a boycott against the financial industrial complex. They couldn't beat us, so they're trying to co-opt Bitcoin as much as they can. Now, we know it's proof of work. We know it's nodes. We know it's miners. We know it's, self-custody. We know that there's different components. We know that there's developers. They will attack on every front. We need to be vigilant of all the attack vectors. We need to engage in, why is suddenly a core developer that's meant to be a cypherpunk setting up a Bitcoin treasury company and talking about stable coins, and at the same time resisting different competing implementations of nodes? Why is that happening? This is the open source boardroom that we have at Bitcoin. So what do you need to do? You need to figure out where you want to live in the world. That the closer you are to America, the worse it gets. That's the reality in the multipolar world order. America is 100% co-opted and controlled by the financial, military, and technical industrial complex. They were promised the Western Hemisphere. They'll get the Western Hemisphere. They'll asset strip. But they're not America first. They're not Europe first. They're not UK first. They're not Canada first. If you think Mark Carney is Canada first, he's a Bank of England pundit that was set up in order to extract the resources for the financial industrial complex and make you think that he's some kind of leftist rainbow fairy so that America can tell their story of we're the men and you're the women. That's the rhetoric, right?
Yeah, that's pretty spot on. Yep.
Yeah.
So you just need to be aware of it. Now, I personally believe, this is my speculation, the Middle East will be the fastest growing part of the world. You need to decide whether that's right for you, whether it's not. Asia's going to rise. It's more authoritarian. If you're okay with that, you just need to decide whether that's right for you, what right parts of that are. I think for the first time in millennia, Africa is going to be able to use its resources, and Africa will be one of the fastest growing regions in the world. And it's going to get worse and worse and worse in Europe, in America, in Canada, in Australia, in the Western Hemisphere, unless you're rich. If you're rich, it's going to be the best time ever. So if you're already rich, you need to be planning, what are you going to do in an environment? Now, there is a global trend that we're all fighting together, which is on this multipolar world, They're trying to build that, World Economic Forum, one global central bank digital currency in an environment where everything rolls up into one. That's a global trend that we all fight together. How do we fight it? We are in a battle of decentralization versus centralization. I'm still on X and I should be on Nostr. We should all be realizing I'm still using a bit of ChatGPT. I should be running my own LLMs, and I'm experimenting with all that. Look, you're not going to get all of this right. Just set a plan. We need to become more decentralized because essentially they want Bitcoin to succeed, but they want it to succeed in custody. And the new elites of the world are going to be the Bitcoin and self-custody people while they try and custody everyone else. And you don't know who they're going to steal it, who they're going to wrap it up for, all of these different things. So location, sovereign individual, understand, put together a plan for that, own more Bitcoin each month. Don't fall for borrowing against it, leverage, or any of this stuff. And be very aware of your spending happens and use it as the boycott that it is. Bitcoin boycotts the Fed. Bitcoin in self-custody boycotts BlackRock. Bitcoin that you don't borrow against boycotts the banks. And Bitcoin that makes you wealthy, where you start investing in local businesses and decentralized and all sorts of stuff, disrupts Silicon Valley and the investment banking cartel as well. And if you need to take care of yourself, your people, and your community around you, this is what everyone needs to prepare for if you're staying in the West.
Simon, you are speaking my language so much here. I think this was like a perfect kind of encapsulation of what do we do with the information from this conversation, and how do we handle it as individuals. And it's, what we've been doing here for 10 years now. Learn how to get your own Bitcoin wallets and self-custody them. Learn how to secure things properly. But even beyond that, running nodes, like what is the rule set that you stand behind, and are you going to enforce it yourself when it comes to your own wallets? Even when it comes to mining, there's been an uprising of new kind of home pleb miners. Exactly. So like learn the stack piece by piece and work your way up to becoming a more and more sovereign individual. And one of my favorite things that you said is learn how to use Bitcoin as a money as well. It's excellent for saving over long term, but it's also a sovereign currency that you can use yourself. And so you can actually, if there's not already something existing, create a local circular economy. We did it here in Calgary, and we've got the SAT market that we run, and we have people where you can get your food and your handyman and whatever you need locally with Bitcoin, and you can start that in your own community. So I'm so glad that we're able to not only have this overarching discussion over the geopolitical implications of what is going on, not only in Venezuela, but far beyond that, and how we have kind of come to this point, but how to handle it as individuals. So, Simon, is there any kind of final things that you'd like to tack in here? Anything that you'd like to come up? And Nathan, you go ahead too.
I do want to jump into, and Simon, in that answer as well too. I want to get your sense, just to kind of round everything out as well too. What do you expect we're going to see happen now in Venezuela? Do you think that the current VP is going to be the one to sit in power? Do you think they'll let the opposition take a chance, do another election? Clearly, none of what's happened is for the benefit of the Venezuelan people. And so, what's your best kind of assessment of what's going to happen on the ground there as well?
Yeah, so let me speculate a bit, and it will just be speculation. Firstly, Venezuela is a self-custody story. Look what happens when you don't self-custody. Any Venezuelans that self-custodied, they can take their private keys wherever they need to go, whatever happens, because we're not sure what is going to happen. And what they tend to do is they game plan it out. So firstly, I am deeply suspicious that we just got a Maduro regime change and not the entire regime change. That means that Maduro most likely agreed, and the existing power structure remains, but they have agreed to give all the resources to US corporate interest in exchange for bribes. And so the corruption continues. I think they're going to flood the market with oil. So that would be, disinflationary. That's one way of controlling. So, you know, that's a side effect that's going to help a lot of people that are struggling right now. I think they're going to play immigration games. And if the existing, what we don't know is, I think the existing power structure will build an authoritarian state that tests and becomes a laboratory like Gaza for all the technical industrial complex technology. And so I think they're going to test a lot of their control grids. Now, if they want to escalate that into military operations, then they'll start funding militia groups. They'll create civil unrest campaigns. They'll do color revolutions. And I'm not sure whether this was compensation for the military industrial complex to make up for lost revenue in the Middle East, or whether this is going to end up a technical industrial complex surveillance grid. But I do know that all the resources are going to be American. And by American, not an American sovereign wealth fund, American corporate interest. So that means stocks will continue to go up. The debt will continue to become more and more distressed in US. I think as we get the new, Trump administration Federal Reserve, they'll get rates down, and that will push long-term rates up. That means your mortgage goes up, your cost of living in terms of all assets go up. And there may be some relief in terms of flooding the market with oil and getting oil prices down. So you just got to kind of manage that. Bitcoin, gold, fixed price assets. I think Bitcoin can be suppressed to try and fear you while gold's going up. But I have zero doubt of the long-term future of Bitcoin in terms of number go up tech. And in terms of, I'm not sure whether we're going to get, I personally don't believe this is Iraq or Syria model where they just try and manufacture chaos. I think they want organized Orwellian control grids where they can come in and receive the investment that they need to extract all of these resources. And I think they want their rates to be as low as possible, which requires, civility and not chaos, to get their insurance premium for the rates that they need to get the investment. But they're going to, the rest of Latin and Central America, that you got a couple of models. I think we as Bitcoiners need to recognize the truth about El Salvador. El Salvador is building its Bitcoin strategic reserves. It's doing the best that it can. But to create that level of peace, you had to cooperate with the IMF and various factions of power. I'm not judging that, but that power still exists within El Salvador because the alternative is Venezuela, right? So people will choose. Do you want to do El Salvador and bow down to IMF and financial industrial complex? And maybe the Bitcoin strategic reserve story can become a story. Maybe we watch this Bitcoin sovereign wealth within Venezuela. These are all long shots. But the reality is the Western hemisphere is controlled by the financial industrial complex. And Bukele needs to implement full submission to the technical industrial complex, including all the prison control grids for all the mass deportations, that anyone that they want to disappear from America happens. And I'm sorry, but if we're a leader, that's a better model than what's happening in Venezuela, which is you take the corruption, you siphon off all the money, and you engage in some kind of theater to look like the Trump administration has taken out Maduro, while all the assets are just extracted and it just becomes a nightmare. That's the choice for the whole region. Europe only really has one sovereign country, and that's Norway because of their sovereign wealth. The rest is going to be rolled up into the European Union, which means you become a vassal for this complex. The rest of the world, they're going to have genuine change. Growth doesn't disappear. Capital doesn't disappear. Capital gets redistributed. And whenever the FIC wants to manage capital outflows from America, once they've extracted all they can, they've got their partnerships with the Gulf countries and BRICS and various other nations that have all agreed to what happened. So here's my one final thing that I think is really important. from all my analysis, I'll put a lot of money in saying this is not World War III. This is a managed chaos into world powers agreeing how the world's going to be split up. And this is definitely not World War III, but they need you to believe it's World War III so that you fall for all their psyops and operations and fear campaigns and media and propaganda.
Beautiful. Thank you, Ben.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, there's a million more threads that I could tug on, and but I want to also be respectful of Simon's time. I feel like we're going to need a follow up at some point here, but yeah, I mean, I just want to throw in a bit of a selfish question, Simon. What do you give Alberta's chances of being a sovereign state? We've got a referendum coming up, and I'd love to exude a sovereign wealth fund to the tune of what Norway's capable of, given that we're sitting on so many resources. But I don't know.
Yeah. I think Canada is fully owned and controlled by the same financial industrial complex that controls America, Israel, Europe, Australia, America. Yeah. So I think, Canada's not sovereign. If you end up building a strategic reserve, that's how you build yourself out of this. I just personally believe that nobody comes into power unless they're compromised and compliant. And Mark Carney is compromised and compliant, and all factions of power. I don't believe democracy exists. I believe all elections are rigged. I believe that, and I believe that, networks like Jeffrey Epstein taught us that these sophisticated control operations, this isn't a person. This is a complex of a century of relationships that were built. No one person can be that networked. And they created a very, very sophisticated compromise network where nobody can default because they'll be, throwing themselves in. And I think Canada fits squarely within that proof of weapons network, sadly. There are stories of countries like Singapore reverse colonizing, and it was done by taking strategic assets and putting them in sovereign wealth funds, and then using those sovereign wealth funds in order to negotiate with the financial industrial complex. If that happens, then that's how Canada gets out. But you're going to need leadership that does that, and I don't see any.
Yeah, Nathan, we need to get to work on those Alberta separatists creating their Bitcoin strategic reserve and capitalizing on all the oil we're sitting on. But awesome, Nathan. Any final word for you, and then Simon, I'll give you a final word to depart with everybody.
No, Simon, hugely appreciate you coming here. And just to add to that, yeah, we got the strategy now. So Alberta has to build up its resources where they get all the Bitcoiners and their Bitcoin to come collect in Alberta so that we can have the wealth that we need with the resources that we have to exit Canada and get the hell out of here.
To Simon, decolonize, if you will.
To decolonize. We got to decolonize Alberta. That's a great term. I'm going to use that one from now on. Simon, thank you so much for coming and joining us last minute. Super appreciated. You're just a wealth of knowledge. Where can everybody go to check out your Twitter, your YouTube, all your links?
Yeah, I do all my real-time updates on X. I'm weirdly spend so much time there because I'm kind of at the semi-retired phase of my life. So I try and give as much as I can on X and, react real time to some of these things and just try and give everyone a step back, follow the money. There's a bigger picture. You can follow, there's a rainstorm coming, but you can't follow every raindrop. You got to see the bigger picture, and you got to focus your time and energy on what's going to make a difference. For you, that's a big problem. But then I go live on YouTube, Simon Dixon, every week, and I do it as a discipline because I do this week in Bitcoin and tech and follow the money. I do this week in macro and follow the money, and this week in geopolitics. And I just publish it into a 3-hour marathon once a week to make sure that I'm following everything. And then in case I get taken out of any of my networks, I back it all up on simondixon.com.
Amazing. Are we going to get you on Nostr soon or what?
I'm on Nostr already, but I keep finding myself on X. I need someone to create like. Are you fully in Nostr? Like, are you out of X?
I use both. You know, it's tough because trying to educate people as they're new to the space. Everybody on Nostr pretty much already knows what Bitcoin is, so it's kind of preaching to the choir. So I need to capture people as they come in through traditional rails and then maybe funnel them there. But we can find you on Nostr still, right?
Yeah, I'm on Nostr. I just have to force myself to use it because the network effect of X has really captured me. But I know that I'm building my social credit score, and I know that I'm not going to be able to speak on X soon unless I bow down to the algorithm. So we have to be on Nostr at some point, and we need to figure that out as a community, or however we're going to do it, because we have freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach for a reason. Because we're now allowed to talk about everything because they want to know what we're talking about, so they can restrict our travel. They can determine what we're meant to be, who we really are. And it's all part of a pre-crime algorithm. I see it in the UK. You know, I left the UK because of that. But yeah, we are building that. No one's, this is, you know, we've got that gift. We need to play with what we got. There's no such thing as perfection. We can only just get better. And maybe hold each other to account. So I'll come back when there's some crazy events, and we'll try and turn it into a Bitcoin story again.
Amazing. Gentlemen, I want to thank you both. And the last thing I'll wrap by saying is, for the people that have come and that are watching this, it's fantastic to be informed and learning about what's going on in the world. But take heed of Simon's kind of final guidance in and around becoming that sovereign individual. It is so important, and you're losing the point of everything if you're not able to do that. So get yourself Bitcoin, get self-custody, and then go down the rabbit hole of securing it properly, running nodes, self-mining, home mining, even diving into Nostr, all of that. So at the end of all of these episodes, I always play a little clip pointing you towards a learn page where there is step-by-step individual tutorials on every single thing that we talked about there. And if you're completely new, just start one video at a time and work your way through it. If you get through, you know, a total of 9 to 10 videos in a year, you're going to be miles ahead of just about anybody else. So Simon, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And everybody else, have a wonderful rest of your weekend. We'll see you guys soon.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.